There are many layers of meaning, political, cultural, religious, to unpack in the inauguration of India's new parliament building. What was most interesting to me, however, was how it expresses ongoing attempts to rewrite our history. This is an issue that we haven't really addressed directly in Thinking Medieval before, but it's about time that we do that. So let's examine one particular object from the inauguration, the Senghol scepter, and see what it reveals about our memories of the medieval past in 2023. I'm Anirudh Kanisetti, historian author of Lords of the Deccan. Welcome to Thinking Medieval, where every week we tell you something new about our complex, innovative past. Always feel free to check out our research and citations below and join us in figuring out how to think about our messy, bloody, dazzling history. In the last couple of weeks, much ink has been spilled on the Senghol, which quite a few online sources describe as a Chola-era scepter. I'm not going to ask why a royal scepter linked to rule by divine appointment was selected as a symbol of a temple of democracy. What I will try to address is the claim that it is Chola. Now, as far as we know, the general consensus is that the Parliament's Senghol was commissioned by the Pontiffs of Thiruvaduturai in 1947, nearly 700 years after the collapse of the Cholas. So, why call it Chola and not Nayaka or Tanjavur Maratha? During the reigns of these early modern rulers in the 17th and 18th centuries, there are much more extensive mentions of Senghols. But then, if the Senghol was made in 1947, why not simply just call it what it is, which is a modern artifact? The answer comes down to the way that we imagine history and what we think we have inherited from it. In an interview, dancer Dr. Padma Subramaniam, who had a role to play in the recent rediscovery of the Senghol, mentioned that the South has been more fortunate to preserve its heritage and traditions. And yeah, the idea that the Cholas represent some primordial past which has been preserved in South India is pretty popular. But what does it really mean? What does it imply? So let's take dance as an example, simply because it's one of the few South Indian phenomena that have been studied deeply over time. Devadasis or Tevaratiyals, who were temple women in the Chola period, were generally local landladies, and there's little evidence that they were specifically dancers. A new phenomenon emerged in the Nayaka or Tanjavur Maratha period of the 18th century when Devadasis were instead influential cultured courtesans. They also developed a dance form that was reinvented and claimed by Anglophone Tamil middle classes in the 20th century and has come down to us as traditional Bharatanatyam. So, which one of these is Bharatanatyam's true history? In claiming that today's Bharatanatyam is the true inheritor of an ancient tradition, we're ignoring how various forms of dance and the socio-cultural activities around them developed over time. Is all that not our history as well? From an objective standpoint, it's really strange that one state of affairs is imagined as true history and that others are not. Because the Chola period itself was an innovative time, quite distinct from those that came before. We might as well all return to the Iron Age and go back to building megaliths. But even that came with its own innovations. And so on and so on. There is really no original history anywhere. The resurgence of the Cholas in political memory is especially strange given that most of their successors rarely mention them. When the armies of the Vijayanagara Empire arrived in Tamil Nadu in the 14th century, they looked to the Pandyas, who were rivals of the Cholas. Even after the fall of Vijayanagara, the Cholas were only vaguely referred to by local rulers such as the Nayakas. The Nayakas actually claimed authority as successors of Vijayanagara rather than the Cholas. So only one exceptionally erudite ruler, the Tanjavur Maratha king Sarfoji II, claimed the title of Chola king in the 18th to 19th centuries. In the 20th century, the Cholas were rediscovered and reimagined as unparalleled conquerors, as unparalleled devotees, as exemplary Tamil nationalist heroes. This is not the way that they had been seen before, as we just saw, but given the psychological world that accompanied colonialism, partition, independence, and debates about Hindi imposition, it's understandable. But public conversations about the Cholas haven't really changed in the decades since. Instead, they are now Hindu nationalist heroes, not just Tamil nationalist heroes. RSS Supremo Mohan Bhagwat had this to say on the Cholas, specifically the conqueror Rajendra I in 2015. He established a model of good governance in Bharat and had promulgated in Southeast Asia the benevolent influence of eternal Bharatiya culture. The ruling party is keen to link itself with this image especially. But to what extent are these ideas based on historical fact and how much of it is political imagination? On the question of good governance, decades of historical research has shown that the Chola state was nothing like a modern one. The scale and penetration of the modern Indian state was unimaginable to a medieval state, which generally resembled an agglomeration of small allied political bubbles. All these academics have pointed out that the Chola state under Rajendra I was extremely militarized. It needed conquest to maintain itself, to impose its authority onto allied political bubbles, and to undertake its spectacular feats of engineering and logistics. When it ran out of manpower, as most conquest states tend to do, it became a smaller regional entity, once again a collection of political bubbles. It was only for about 90 years, less than a third of its total history, that the Chola state was actually on the offensive. Now, I can only speak for myself, but the history of how the Cholas attempted to centralize a multicentric world and how they achieved what they did despite such multicentricity is much more interesting than the vague claim of good governance. Next, the historical evidence for the Southeast Asia claim is just one inscription left by Rajendra I in the Amritaghateshwara temple in Tirukadayur. That's published in South Indian Inscriptions 22, number 20, if you want to look it up. There's little to no evidence of lasting Chola control in Southeast Asia, aside from a few lines in this single inscription. It's much more likely that the Chola attack there was a limited raid, more in this video here. But facts and evidence don't seem to matter in our modern memory of the Cholas. We see the past through a politics of emotion, a politics of returning to our roots, while dismissing histories that are inconvenient and misremembering histories that we claim to respect. Since 2014, there's been such persistent complaining that the Cholas are not talked about. They absolutely are, but mostly through complaints that they aren't talked about, or the same inane lines about their heroic conquests. Specifics never seem to enter the picture, for they are not as politically useful as vague emotions. If we really want history to be remembered as it was, it's time for more than grand symbolic gestures. Until then, it's clear what the whole Sengol furor is really about. Calculated politics rather than a return to the past. If you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Follow us everywhere on social media. You can find me on Instagram at Anirbuddha and at Connected Histories, and on Twitter at Ekaniseti. We'll see you next week.